So I would like to welcome you all. We still have a few people joining, but that's all right. They won't miss out on anything because I always begin these Zooms by welcoming everyone and then doing a little bit of, generic chat about the pattern and that sort of thing. Right now, people who are joining are telling us where they're coming from in the chat, and it's really fun because we've got people from Annapolis, Colorado, Pasadena, Regina, Calgary, Manitoba, and it's always a really interesting thing to do these to see how far apart we are, but how we are all brought together by our fabulous craft of knitting. So our Zoom today is for the Crab People socks, and this is going to be a little bit about the pattern and about where it came from, but it's a lot of the techniques that I'm going to give you in order to make sure that you are successful in knitting these socks. I like to consider this pair of socks to be more of an intermediate level knit because while it uses mosaic, which is very beginner friendly, this mosaic actually slips multiple stitches at once, which is a little bit more challenging than classic mosaic that only ever slips one stitch at a time. So it behaves a little bit more like a stranded colorwork sock than some do, and that's why I consider this to be intermediate. However, the sock itself is built off of a basic vanilla type sock, so that's kind of fun because it means that there's a lot of customization you can do for fit, length, that sort of thing. So the sock uses a standard cuff. It uses a standard heel flap and a standard wedge toe, which means that you can alter the fit by changing the width and the height of your heel flap and how you do your decreases on your toe, how long you make the toe, that sort of thing. And I chose to go with a framework like that for this sock because it does make it very easy to customize the fit for those with more experience. I myself, when I knit a sock of this sort, will always make the heel flap taller because I have a high instep, and so that fits me a bit better. And sometimes I will actually make the heel flap a bit narrower because I have a narrow heel. So that's one of the reasons for the choice there. Overall, this was inspired by my trips to coastlines. And I love to go to coastlines and wade through tide pools and putter around on the beach. And I find crabs to be a very interesting species because they come in all sorts of different sizes, from itty bitty things the size of a dime all the way up to something that's kind of the size of a football and deeply scary and apparently will eat you if you don't move fast enough. And in fact, there is some thinking that possibly Amelia Earhart's remains were never found on the island they think she landed on because she got eaten by crabs after she passed away, which is a scary thing. Really big crabs on that island. They are really interesting, though. They're completely different from things that we're used to in terms of wildlife, and they all have their own habitats and their ways of doing things. I do find a lot of them very fascinating because they will dance on the beach when they are courting each other, and some of them will actually wave at each other. So when I created the mosaic charts for this, they all have their little claws up because that's the idea, is they're doing their beach dance. The other part of the sock is inspired by kind of the historical things. If you go to Britain, for example, you'll find a lot of the beaches there have beach huts that you can change in, and a lot of them are painted in stripes, and then old-timey beach costumes always fascinate me too. So at one point in time, they were made out of wool, and you were considerably more covered up than you are now, and a lot of those were striped, or you might wear striped stockings with them, which to me is like, wouldn't you just drown weighted down by all that wool? But hey, it worked for them at that time, but I wanted to put some of that sort of history and fun into these socks as well. So that's why the feet are striped. So on the note of the stripes in the socks, when you get to the foot, if you would prefer to change the depth of each stripe, go for it. There's no reason why you can't. One of the things about the stripes that I might forget to mention later, so I'm going to right now, is that while they are each stripe in the foot done as 8 rows of a color and then change, if you have a really short foot, you might want to reduce that to 6 rows so that you can get more stripes on the foot of your sock, as opposed to somebody like me with my size 11s where 8 rows made a lot of sense for the thickness of stripes. So that's just something to be aware of, that you can do a lot of customizing on the socks. So I'm going to switch my view now to the view down on the table so that we can look at the pattern and go through the pattern, and then I'm going to demonstrate a few things for you. And I just want to change my view so I can see what you see and make sure that I am underneath the camera properly. So I want to go through the pattern and just go through what is where in the pattern, because that's always really helpful, and then point out some things in here that are important to know. So the pattern obviously begins with some nice pictures and your inspiration, and then it talks about the yarn. Yes, you can do some yarn substitution with this pattern if you really want to, but it is knit meant for Socknado. heavy fingering yarn. And if you decide to substitute with a different brand of yarn that's a thinner yarn, just be aware of the fact that that's going to change potentially your gauge. If you kept the gauge the same and use a skinnier yarn, then you might find that your crabs get a little bit too lacy. So you would probably want to go down a needle size and go up a sock size in order to have the crabs sit properly in the stitches. So even with our yarn, if you switch to revival fingering, for example, you would probably want to go down the needle size, go up the size in the sock in order for the crabs to not look kind of weird and meshy and stretched out. One of the things that Mosaic often relies on for structure is actually the gauge. And in this case, the crabs are Mosaic garter stitch and the background is stocking stitch. So the crabs being garter stitch actually do help with tensioning the background. But if you were knitting with a skinnier yarn, you might lose some of that little bit of helping crab claw, shall we call it. Back on the pattern, this page here in this column is important because this talks a little bit about things to keep an eye out for. So whenever you're flipping through one of our patterns, look for notes because this is where we'll put things that we want you to know. So in this case, be aware that the Mosaic crabs are raised. So being stocking stitch, you can see on the edge of the sock how they stand out a bit, and that's intentional. If you change that chart so that you're doing it all stocking stitch, you will no longer have a crab. You're going to have what looks more like a lobster because the garter stitch pulls your crab into the round body, and that's why they are deliberately designed to be a little bit raised. It helps you with your tensioning, and it also helps to keep the crabs round. If you knit them in stocking stitch, it elongates the body of the crab, and then you're going to have lobsters. Not necessarily a bad thing, but they won't be crabs anymore. The other thing about this is that the note mentions the crab motifs in this sock will have you slipping multiple stitches at a time. So we're going to go over tensioning that, but I just draw your attention to that. If you are a tight knitter and you find that because of this behaving a little bit more like a stranded colorwork sock, that your sock is not very elastic. So technically they should be quite elastic. Mosaic is more elastic than stranded colorwork, but because there's more slipping, you may find that you don't have as much elasticity, in which case do what you would do with stranded colorwork. And for the crab sections, not the stripes in between and the foot, but for the crabs themselves, you might want to increase your needle size. So instead of the recommended 2.5 millimeter, go to a 2.75 millimeter just to get a little more ease in that area. That'll help you with getting the sock over your heel. So technically Mosaic is quite elastic, and we have a second pair of socks here too, and you can see it's quite stretchy. But when we had the sock test knit, one of our test knitters found that for her it got a bit tight. And so this is a recommendation that I'm just making for anybody who does knit these socks later on. If the crabs get a bit tight for you, go up a needle size on the charts of the crab, and that should give you a little bit more ease again for getting that over your foot. Being Mosaic stitch, we only work with one color at a time. So while there are floats to manage, you are only managing the floats in the color that you're working, which is a lot easier than stranded color work because you're not trying to carry another yarn at the same time. So Mosaic is nice because you knit 2 rows of one color, 2 rows of a second color, 2 rows of the first color. So they alternate back and forth, and you only have to manage that one color at a time. So considerably easier. I would consider these socks to be a gateway to proper stranded colorwork socks if you want to think of them that way, because you will get experience in working with multiple slip stitches, which creates a float. But like I say, you're not managing the yarn in the same way. It's not as complicated, and it's a lot easier to keep these having some ease and stretch in them. And then last but not least, there's a note in here about the charts, and they include a color key line on the right side of the chart. So when we look at the charts, I have included this for you. It has the row number, and it has these alternating boxes. And what this does is it tells you which color you're to work the 2 rows to the side with. This is helpful because when you look at the chart by itself, it's easy to forget what color you're supposed to be knitting with. The key here will tell you. So if you're partway through it and you pick it up later on and you're about to start these rows, this tells you that you're going to knit with the lighter background color. So that's what this is. This is not a stitch to be knit. It is a key that helps you keep straight which colors you're knitting. It's kind of common with Mosaic charts that are older style to put a key in there because some of them it's a lot not as obvious. And in really classical styles of Mosaic charts, this has both rows charted, but classical style they won't. So it's much, much harder to tell what color you're working with. I like the key on something like this because it does help me to keep it straight, because if I put it down, get distracted, my cat grabs my ball of yarn and runs, this will keep me knitting with the correct color. So just a little thing to notice is that that is not a stitch to knit. Next, we get to the sizing on these socks. And the sizing on them, there's 4 sizes included in the sock. And if you are a tight knitter, again, you can go up a size. You can always customize the foot of your sock. And if you were knitting a large to get a bit of a more ease in the leg, you can change to a medium for the foot. That's something that you can do with the style of pattern that's been developed here. But there are 4 sizes, and it goes from 56 stitches to 72. So that should cover most people in terms of the size of their foot. If you're knitting for your 6'4" hubby, as one of my friends is, then you might want to increase the needle size because Socknado is very forgiving on gauge. And if you go up a needle size, your sock will automatically be a little bit bigger. So if you need more than 72 stitches, you can bring it up by increasing your needle size. I don't have a size. This increases 4 stitches for the first 3 sizes, and I don't have one in between 64 and 72 because I have found with other patterns where I include that size, it's very rarely ever knit. So hopefully you're all fine with the going from 64 to 72 in the sizing. But if need be, and somebody is watching this at some point and would really have wished for a 68 stitch size sock, let me know because I can get you the charts for that. But right now, they are the most commonly used sizes, and the sock includes a fair range of them. The rest of the pattern will give you the instructions. And we start off and it says using a stretchy cast on of your choice. So you can use whatever cast on you want. If you are a person who doesn't like learning alternate cast ons and wants something that's very easy to do, there is one option that you can do, which is a cast on that uses a plain old long tail cast on, but there's a trick with it that allows you to make that cast on a little bit stretchier. And I'm actually going to show you what I do. And you will find this with, like, for example, Patty Lyons has a very helpful book on all sorts of knitting tips and tricks, and she uses this one too. When you're doing a long tail cast on and you want to have some ease in it, and I will tell you all my socks, I use a long tail cast on, but I use this little trick to get my nice stretchy cast on. When I do the long tail cast on, and I'm going to move these from behind so that we can see this a little bit more clearly. What I do is I put my fingertip on the needle, create my new stitch, and my fingertip spaces it. So you see how there's some space in between? That puts some ease into a plain old long tail cast on that it might not otherwise have. And it's a nifty little trick for a sock because that gives you a more elastic edge without having to go and use a different cast on. There's lots and lots of great options for stretchy cast ons, but I'm too lazy to go and look them up or remember them. So you can see this stretches out quite a bit, and it gets you a way to have a nice loose cast on for the top of your sock without having to learn anything different. I don't recommend a knitted cast on for the top of a sock because it's very hard to put any extra ease in it. Don't use a cable cast on, but you can modify a long tail, or you can switch to some of the other different versions of long tail that have like an extra yarn over in there and so on. There are some people who wildly disagree with casting on over the thickness of 2 needles because they say that it's going to not actually make this cast on stretchier. You just get bigger loops. And as somebody who has been doing that as an alternate way of casting on and getting extra ease, I would say I disagree. It will get you a stretchier cast on, but you will have a more frilly look on the top of your sock. So that is something to bear in mind. You want ease on the top of your cast on, but it's very easy to adapt a long tail to having that nice little bit of space in there and making it easier to work with in terms of not having to go and do anything fancy. I unfortunately am old enough as a knitter that I just can't be bothered to do anything too fancy when it comes to my socks. I just use the spacing trick, and I've never had an issue with one going on, no matter who the sock is knit for. Then we do a knit 2, purl 2 ribbing according to the pattern, and you will notice something, which is that the actual sample of the sock has a knit 1, purl 1. That's a little bit of an interesting thing. I tend to always do mine as a knit 1, purl 1. Totally forgot that I wrote it as a knit 2, purl 2, but the knit 2, purl 2 has more elasticity than a knit 1, purl 1. And so if you have somebody who needs a little bit more of a grip at the top of your sock, do a knit 2, purl 2. So the pattern doesn't quite match the sample. Didn't notice that until today. you're just fine no matter what kind of ribbing you do on the sock. And the depth of the ribbing won't matter. If you're using one of our kits, you have more than enough yarn. You can change that so that you have a much deeper ribbing. You could make it shallower. It's completely customizable and up to you. But you can do what I did in the original sock, which is knit one, purl one, or you can do knit two, purl two. And I alternate them. It kind of is like which way is the wind blowing. I like them both, and it doesn't affect the fit of the sock in the end for me. Again, if you have somebody who might have skinny ankles and you're making a shorter sock, you might want to go to the knit two, purl two, just simply because it's got a little bit more of an pull in than a knit one, purl one. So I wanted to bring that to people's attentions because, like I say, none of us noticed it. Tech editors didn't see it. Sample knitters didn't see it. None of us saw it. There it is. All right. There are some other things to notice in the pattern. So on the size small only, the charts for the crabs require 57 stitches. The size is technically a 56 stitch sock, so you will have 56 stitches in your cuffin in the first 10 rows, and then you will add 1 stitch for size small only, and that's so that you can get the charts around the crab leg properly done. So this sock has an increase with a knit front and back in 1 row. That brings you to the right number of stitches for the charts. And then you will find later in the pattern, when you get down to the heel, it will tell you to knit 2 together at the start of a row. And what that does is it brings you back down to the 56 stitch size again for the rest of your sock. So size small only has that 1 stitch increase, goes through the crabs, and then it takes it away again at the ends. The other socks do not. And this is just simply so that we can fit the charts into the stitches in the sock and have them make sense. I want lots of crabs dancing on my sand. If you do some Googling and look at crabs when they go into their courtship season, there's usually quite a few crabs on the beach, and that's where this inspiration came from. I should back up just slightly and also mention that when you are doing these socks and choosing colors, if you're not working with one of the kits, just make sure that one color is light and one color is dark so that your crabs show up nicely. If you're using a really variegated yarn, you need lots and lots and lots of contrast. So this crab color here, as you can see, it's a pooling yarn and it's very, very variegated, but against the dark blue, it shows up just fine. So that's just something to watch for with your color choices. If you're not sure if you've got contrast in your yarn, take a photo and turn it into a black and white color picture, and that will tell you if you can tell the difference between the two. If you can't really, then the crabs are not going to show as well. If you like that effect, that's fine. Just means that your crabs are dancing in the twilight, but it is something to watch for with your colors. So I did want to bring that little bit of a change in size to your attention. And then each size, when you get to the part where you're doing the crabs, will have charts for each size. So the chart is labeled based on the size, and you will have 2 charts that you work with. So a chart 1 and a chart 2, and note that there will be the size in here. If you are working with the written instructions for the charts instead, the charts will also include the chart 1 and then the size. It will also tell you how many times to repeat the chart. Basically, the charts get repeated around the sock, using up the entire number of stitches in each round. There is some information for that as well in the written instructions, so it will tell you how many times you repeat them, but I also put them in the writtens for the charts because it's just easier if you're a person working with the text not to have to be flipping from page to page to page. So there's just some little bits about the layout on here. So that brings us to, we've talked a little bit about a nice loose cast on. So now I want to talk about dealing with our mosaic charts and making sure that we have ease in there. So I have knit up a little swatch here with an abbreviated sock. And what I want to do is show you the mosaic stitch work where we are slipping more stitches. So I have no contrast cuff on here, and I have my little crabs, and you're knitting the crabs in the sock from the top of the crab down to the bottom of the crab because we're working from the top of the sock down. So you can see the crabs quite clearly here. When you're looking upside down, the charts are also oriented correctly because we start at the bottom of the chart and work to the top of the chart. For people who are not as familiar with working with these charts, look at the numbers because that tells you whether to start at the top or at the bottom. So because number 1 is down here, we're knitting from the bottom up. And again, you'll notice that these are knit with mosaic in terms of garter and stocking stitch. So the background is stocking stitch and the crab itself is garter. In Mosaic, there are places where your stitches will look elongated, and this is a perfect example. And this is because Mosaic works with 2 rows of each color alternating. And any stitches that you're slipping, so this stitch here is these ones in this row here. Sorry, no, it's over here. It's this here, this one. When you're slipping those stitches, they get carried up 2 rows. And so that's going to elongate the stitch. So don't worry if some of your Mosaic stitches look elongated like this one. It's just because it's been slipped and pulled up 2 rows. And you'll see that here, this one was slipped. It looks a little bit larger. A lot of that disappears in the blocking, and the rest of it is just simply a feature of Mosaic. When we look at this sock, because this has been blocked, you do see still an elongated stitch in between the feet of the crabs, and that's normal. But some of the elongation on the stitches around the little claws there have mostly disappeared. So blocking does cover a multitude of sins in tensioning. This sock is not blocked. So I wanted to have one to show you that they are a little bit wonky before you block them, but there's nothing wrong with that. And when you do go to block them, a little bit of tension on the Mosaic will just help all the stitches to even out. But this one is not blocked, and your crabs will be a little bit offline. Once you get them on a sock blocker and you block them, all of that straightens out. So your little legs go straight again, and the body becomes quite nice and rounded. So on this, I am actually at this point here, and I chose to show you a row that has a slip of 4 stitches, because this is the most aggressive place where we are slipping stitches in the sock, and it is the one that will give most people issues. And I just noticed that I do not have my other needle. Where did you go? Well, we'll just use this one. This one's too big, but of course you try to prepare for these, and inevitably it doesn't quite work that way. So let's put the pattern underneath here. We're going to work this row, and it starts off with changing colors. Now, a little trick that I use to remove all of the jogs in Mosaic in a leg of a sock is that every time that you get to the end of a row, you're going to twist your colors. So what you're going to do is take the color you're not working with, bring it up under the other color that you are working with, and if you're not using that color, it wraps around the top. So it gets wrapped. You see that? It's twisted. What that does is it actually anchors the strands, and then you can pull them snug when you change colors, and that gets rid of the jog. So this line here is where there should be a jog, and you see there isn't one because I'm twisting the 2 colors together on every single row. When you twist them on every single row, you can tighten them up and it pulls the jog out in Mosaic. So that is a nifty little trick. And we can kind of see it here on this one where I have twisted them. Let me see if I can get this to show a little better. So you see here how this color is twisted around the dark color. When I change colors, and I've been working with the dark color, what I'm going to do is bring the light color up underneath it, and then I'm going to pull it snug. And what that did is it pulled the 2 rows together. So it gives it a little bit of tightness there, and that gets rid of your jog. Cool, huh? So that is a nifty little trick, and it works with Mosaic. If you're knitting stocking stitch, it's going to behave differently, and you're actually going to see a little bit of a tight stitch pulled there. But in Mosaic, you don't get that. So I am going to knit the 3 stitches that I have to knit at the start of this row in the chart. Now I have to do some slipping, and I have to slip 4 body stitches of the crab. So I'm going to slip them purlwise onto the right-hand needle, and then I will knit my next stitch. So again, you can see this one's elongated because this is a slipped stitch, and it's finally getting knit 2 rows after it was started to be slipped. I spread my stitches out on the right-hand needle because that's going to give you some slack. And once you finish the stitch, you see how you have almost like a little bit of a loop, a gap there? On the wrong side of the sock, it will look almost like a little bit of a Mona Lisa smile. And every time that you are slipping stitches and then knitting again afterwards, this is the way that you will deal with these stitches in order to keep them from pulling in tight and then you getting a little crinkly, nasty thing. If it has pulled tight on you, so this one is pulled tight on me, what you do at the end of slipping those stitches is just pull it loose. You can also grab the back and give it a little bit of slack. So what you want is for those loops to be sitting just a little bit above the knitting, and then it's not going to pull in. So in this particular sock, we have slipped the 4, done a stitch, slipped the 4, done a stitch. Now we knit until we get to the next ones to slip. So we have 5 stitches to knit here. more than 5, sorry, 5 and then 4, because we're going back and forth on the chart. So now I've come to where I'm going to slip my stitches again, spread the stitches out, keep them spread out on the right needle, slip your 4 purlwise, and again, spread them out. Sometimes what I do to spread them is I'll just get that stitch that I'm going to knit next and I'll give it a pull and that spreads the stitches. See how I did there? And then we have that little bit of slack on the back of the sock. And again, we slip our stitches purlwise. See how they're kinked together on the needle? They're all squished up. This is where I stop and I spread them because that will tension my float. They're being a little stubborn because I've actually had to go up on needle size here because some people didn't bring their spare needle. So again, we go to knit our stitch, keep them spread out, and then we have our little bit of slack on the back there. And what that does is it keeps the knitting elastic, so we still are able to pull the sock out and it can go over your heel nicely that way. So that's the trick to making sure that when you're slipping more than one stitch at a time, that you don't end up with the sock pulling in too much on you. And again, these slip stitches can look quite big. When I go later and block that sock, some of that slack is going to pull out just from the blocking. So you see how that doesn't look as big anymore, but it looked huge a moment ago. So are there any questions about that? Just going to check the chat here because it has not fed all the way down. Yeah, looks good. Okay, so slipping, you want to space them. On the back side of your work, like stranded color work, you will see floats. So on this sock that I've been working on, remember I said that it's going to look a little like a Mona Lisa smile before you block this, especially. See these ones here where I've been slipping multiple stitches, they have that little bit of almost a smile look. So there's a little bit of looseness in there. And this allows me to stretch the sock without distorting any stitches, and it will go over your heel nicely because it's important to keep some elasticity. When you're doing floats in stranded color work, it's exactly the same principle. The sneaky little trick is just make sure that the stitches on the right-hand needle are spread out so that you don't end up pulling them really tight. Let's look at the inside of this sock that's not blocked. So again, you can see that there's a little bit of looseness in those floats, a little bit of a Mona Lisa smile. Once they're blocked, they might lie a little bit more flat. So let's actually turn this guy completely inside out. You'll still see a little bit of slack, but you see how they're lying flatter now, and that's because the stitches have flattened out in the blocking. You can still see some where there was a big skip, and there'll be a little bit of slack in there, and that's what allows this to stay nice and elastic. If you are worried about it pulling in too much, having a little bit of extra slack in here is not a bad thing. The only thing that you might notice is that the stitch, the first and last that you knit after a float, oh, wrong side, that's why I couldn't find them. So you might get a larger stitch on each side of the slip because you've got extra slack in the back. So it's a little bit of an art, but what you're looking for is the little Mona Lisa smile. That will give you the solution to not too tight, not too loose. In a sock, you're better to be too loose than too tight, and it's not going to significantly distort the look of the knitting. But that is something that's really important when working the mosaic crabs, and this is why I don't feel that this is a beginner level pattern, because you do have to work with those. So you can see the slips on the inside of the sock, and you can see that they do allow a little bit of elasticity. One of the other reasons for doing this as a garter stitch crab is that garter stitch is more resistant to being squished together. And that actually helps you when you're slipping the stitches in the body because it will force you to leave a little bit of looseness at the back because it doesn't want to be as squished together as does stocking stitch. Stocking stitch can be squished right together, and garter stitch, it's very hard to do that because of the garter bumps. So there are little sneaky things hidden within the design of the crab that will help you in terms of tensioning your floats. The other thing about doing the garter is that mosaic is done in a very angular fashion. You can see it in here. And in this chart where we chart each row, you can see how it looks very elongated. Garter pulls this into a square. So garter stitch mosaic will make this square. If you do stocking stitch, it will look more like the chart. So if you knit this and forgot to do, see how every second row in here is done with dots, which indicates that you're to purl those stitches in a sock. If you didn't do that, you would end up with a lobster because stocking stitch will look like this. So if you forget to do the crabs as a garter, it's not a disaster. It's just that now you have dancing lobsters instead. And believe it or not, I actually looked to make sure the number of legs would be right, just in case somebody did want to turn this into dancing lobsters. So you could play with this in another pattern, for example, and just use the chart to get lobsters. And then you could make yourself lobster socks. But it is an interesting thing about mosaic in terms of the fact that it does pull in when it is garter, and it turns it into a square, not a rectangle. So that is an intriguing little bit there. So the next part of the sock that I wanted to talk about was our heel flap. Lots of people knit socks and they forget about what to do when you're picking up stitches. So I have this as an example where we are just going to pick up along the heel flap, and I want to point a few little things out about that. So this sock was knit by one of my staff, and it's knit fairly loosely, and we have to work back across the sock heel to start the pickup for the gusset. When you go and do this row, that is the first part of picking up around the gusset, what I want you to do is to put a marker in the middle there. And the reason for the marker is that this will be later on in the sock where you will do your color change. So if you can put a color change on the underside of the sock, even if you don't do anything in terms of trying to hide the jog on your sock, at least it's then hidden on the bottom. But I am going to show you a way to hide the jog quite nicely on a sock with stripes, and then it's up to you as to whether or not you want to do this. So I have to knit across these stitches, and wow, she's a much looser knit than I am, which is handy. So technically, what one does with a heel flap is one picks up one stitch in every slipped stitch on the edge of the heel flap. But you notice how for her sock, this one is quite large. This slip stitch has elongated on her. And sometimes, depending on how a heel flap and heel turn is worked, you might end up with actually quite a big gap between the last stitch and the heel flap stitches that you're picking up in. So a sneaky little trick that you can use is to actually pick up an extra stitch here. And in the pattern, there's a note that says that you can do that. So you can pick one up here. And then the other place where people will commonly have holes is down at the end of the heel flap, between the heel flap and the instep stitches. So I'm going to show you to pick up how to pick up an extra stitch there. If you pick up extra stitches, then you will have to do more decreases to get down to the number of stitches for your foot, but that's all right. Basically what you do is you add whatever stitches you need on your heel flap pickup for your gusset, and then you just decrease down to the number of stitches you need. So if you have a little skinny foot and a nice thick ankle like one of my friends, what she will do is that she will not decrease to the same number of stitches in the foot of her sock as she has in the ankle. She will have a different number of stitches in the foot versus the leg. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can do that to help customize the fit of your socks. And in fact, you can change the number of stitches along the foot of your sock if you want. So you can have more here, less here, more here. So if you have a really wide ball of your foot, but a very narrow instep, you might want to actually change the number of stitches. Just a cute little thing that you can do that's not really obvious, but you can tweak that number by how many decreases you do there. So if I want this to be smaller than the leg of my sock, I just decrease to a smaller number of stitches. It will affect how your toe is done, but as long as you know how many stitches you have, there can be some modifications to redo the toe in terms of figuring out your decreases there. But you are allowed to do that. If you add extra stitches, and I almost always do when I'm picking up my gusset, like I say, you might just decrease a couple more rows than you would if you didn't do that. So technically, this is a 56 stitch sock. The heel uses 28 stitches, and you have 28 rows here, so you will pick up 14 in the slip stitches along the edge. Now you see how the slip stitches are a V? The best way to do this is to pick up both legs, because that's going to keep this stitch nice and tight, the one that you're using to pick up in. And then you don't have holes along the side of your gusset. So when we do that, there are no holes along the side. If you pick up in one leg of that stitch, then what happens is that it's going to pull up, and then you do get a hole. To get rid of some of that hole, what you can do is knit into the back of that stitch, and then that will twist it, which will fill in the hole. And it can actually be a fun way to get a little bit of a decorative edge. If you have a lace sock, I often will do that if the pattern doesn't call for it. I'll pick up on one leg, twist them, and then I've got a little row of what looks very lacy and fun along the edge of the sock. So what we're going to do is find our two legs of the sock, edge of the sock heel rather, and then we're going to just knit a stitch. And I have not picked up an extra one there, but you can. So we're just going through 2 legs and we're going to pick up, and I'm going to do several of those, and then I'll switch the other way just so you can see what it looks like. Socks are often meant to do various different things to them based on what you, the knitter, wants to do, and that's just fine. Change a pattern. There's nothing graven in stone that says that you can't. So when we look at these stitches, you see how they're sitting tight against the body of the sock. We don't have any big holes. You see the bit of a gap here from the heel flap to the gusset. You can add a stitch in there if you want to fill that in. Mostly those will just pull in on their own as you keep knitting around the gusset. But if you have a really big gap there, you can throw an extra one in. And then, like I say, just do an extra set of decreases. Now I'm going to pick some up on just one leg of that. And I'm going to not twist them so that you can see how loose they look. And then I'll do some twisted, just because this way you can compare it. If you wanted to put a little line of lace holes into your crab socks, there's no reason why you can't. Sorry, I just noticed I drifted. So I did 4 where I didn't twist them, and now what I'm doing is I've picked this up and it looks like a stitch on my needle. I'll knit into the back, which twists it. So it makes an X, and that's going to mean that it's not as floppy as if I had just knit it and not tightened it up. So there's lots of different ways to pick up for a gusset. Normally you'll do it through the 2 legs, which is nice and tight. Here's some where I didn't do it through. See how they're done through one leg of that slipped stitch, and you see the hole that it did. And then these 4 are the same, but I twisted them. So you see how there's little X's there. So holes and X's. This is a little more decorative. It can be quite pretty. And here there's nothing. The stitches sit right up against the first stitch in your heel flap. So how you pick them up is up to you, but it's a way to change the look of it a little bit. And if you don't want them to form a hole, make sure you go through both legs. So now I'm just going to get the rest of these picked up and show you how to pick up the stitch that will help fill in that hole at the bottom of the gusset. Lots of knitters don't bother to pick up a stitch there, and if a hole forms, they just sew it shut, and there is nothing wrong with doing that. But I don't like the hole because I'm too lazy to go back and deal with it later. So I'm at the bottom of my gusset, and you see there's quite a gap here. If we were to knit, there's going to form a hole. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of sock patterns will have a hole there. So what you're going to do to fill that hole in is pick up either 1 or 2 stitches to fill the hole. When you do that, what you do is you go to the last row of stitches with the heel flap, and you see how there's a line of them here, and you're going to pick up the right leg of that stitch and you're going to knit it. So you're going down a row and picking up that leg. And if you really want to fill that hole in well, then you go to the stitch below the first stitch on the left needle and pick up the leg and knit that as well. So you see now we have stitches that filled in that gap completely. So this is a nifty little trick that you can do with socks in order to fill in the holes. If you don't do it, no harm, no foul. If you do it, then you will have no holes to sew up, and it will give you a little bit of an extra reinforcement there when you move on to the instep stitches. Normally what I would do is either spread my stitches out so that my instep stitches are on a second needle, or I would make sure to mark the instep stitches too, because you're going to have to work with the decreases. So the pattern will tell you to place markers for the instep. I strongly recommend that you do that, because if you don't, well, which is the instep stitch on here and which is not? They're not marked out, and it's hard to tell, and who wants to sit there and count them the whole time? So once you're doing the heel gusset decreases, you will have beginning of round has moved to the bottom of the sock. That's where our color changes take place. And then we will have a marker on each side of the instep. So if you're using DPNs, you can actually isolate the instep stitches on 1 needle or 2 needles and then put the rest of the stitches on others. Or if you're doing magic loop, make sure that you use markers, because you're not going to be able to isolate them completely, because it's going to have an awful lot of stitches on 1 needle and not that many on the other. And that can start to put tension issues at that end of the gusset there. So that's something to remember, is just make sure that you get your border markers in there. So someone in the chat has mentioned that Addi duets for picking up stitches. Yes. So Addi duets are a nice little thing. It has a point on one end and a crochet hook on the other end. And they're really handy because what you can do is use them for picking up stitches. They have a nice long point, and if you're using needles that are blunter, they can help you get through your slip stitches on the edge of your sock if you're a tight knitter. So the person who knit this swatch for me is a loose knitter, and they're really easy to get through. But if they're tight and challenging to get your needle tip into, an Addy Duet is a nice little tool that will help you with it. I use Flexi Flips, as you can see from here, and I really like them, but they are definitely an acquired taste, but they behave very much like magic loops. So what I will do is I will redistribute my stitches once I've done all my pickups in order to have them spread fairly evenly on the needles. So I would have half of the stitches on the front, half of the stitches on the back. When you're working with magic loop or Flexi Flips, one of the things that can happen is that where your needle starts and ends, so if I had, say, for example, a needle on half my heel stitches and the other half are on the other needle, you get a gap. With these needles, what you can do is you can shuffle that start of round back and forth. So move it a few stitches periodically, and that will help you to not get a ladder in that point. One of the nice things about Flexi Flips is that actually you get the two ends of the needles close together when you move to a new one, and so it actually reduces the chances of laddering. But you can still get ladders with both Magic Loop and Flexi Flips, and that is a little trick, is just move this, and one of the reasons for having your beginning of row marked with a marker instead of the start of a Magic Loop is that then you can move that back and forth if you're a person that finds that you get ladders. So that's just a little trick too that I will use sometimes to make sure I don't have ladders. Any questions about that? Excellent. The next thing I wanted to talk about, so now we have got our gussets done and we have gotten down to our number of stitches for our feet. Oh, I got to back up. The sock is written technically for 2 rows of crabs. You have chart 1, chart 2, and that allows the crab to alternate. If you want to lengthen the sock like this one, then what you do is chart 1, chart 2, chart 1. There is a note in the pattern about that, but I'm just bringing it to your attention because one of my test knitters did not see the note and was quite concerned about what chart should she do to lengthen her sock. So chart 1, chart 2, chart 1 when you're lengthening. And if you really want to go crazy and make knee highs, you can add more charts in, but I would probably want to think about moving from size to size in that. These are a nice long sock, so it's a proper good length. Most people's calves will flare above the 3rd set of crabs, so it'll fit most people. But if you also do have, by the way, a narrow ankle and a wide calf flare right away, don't add an extra row of crabs because they are a little less elastic than regular knitting. But on the foot, now we have things to talk about on switching from color to color and doing our stripes. There's different ways that you can go about carrying the yarns or not carrying the yarns. There's a couple of things that are yeses in terms of carrying your yarn up the foot of your sock, and there are a couple of things that are no's. So this one, I've carried it part way, and then what I did was I broke it for each stripe and just wove the ends in on this later. So either one is completely valid. If you are going to carry the yarn, you've got to make sure that, again, like slip stitches, there's a little bit of slack so that if the sock stretches out, that you're not having a pucker underneath your foot, which would be uncomfortable. So you need a little bit of slack in the yarn that you carry up the stripe. If you catch the yarn in the sock like I've done here, and one of my staff again prepared this swatch for me, and she did exactly what I told her not to do, and she caught, but it turned out to be good. She caught the yarn repeatedly here. If you do that in the middle of the stripe, you might see that. So when we look closely here, you will actually see the green showing between the stitches where she has caught this. So normally when I'm carrying a yarn in a sock and I don't want to see it in the middle, I don't catch it in. In this case, I deliberately caught it because I wanted later on to be able to show you that while it's not super visible, one can kind of find it. Let me just find that on the inside so that I can show you on the outside. So, well, I did a pretty good job of that, not tensioning it too tight. It is in here. You see that teeny tiny little puckery bit in there? That's where I caught the yarn in the middle of the stripe. So when it's 8 rows, you don't need to catch the yarn in between the color changes. It's not necessary. I've done that here on this one too, where I caught it once. You can see how it distorts this stitch that it's caught by. So it's made it a little bit, it's pulled it on the inside, and that means that you get a tiny pucker on the outside. But what you do want to do when you change the color is twist them so that you don't get a hole. So if you're carrying the colors and you're changing them, and we're going to do that on here, what we're going to do, and we have got to the point where we are doing a color change. We have our marker. This is the bottom of the foot. What we're going to do is bring this yarn up underneath the working yarn. This is the one we're moving to. Wrap it around and bring it up again. This twists them together. It anchors them well. And we're just going to start knitting. On the inside, what I want you to do is to pay attention to how tight this is. If it's pulled up really tight, see what it's doing? It's puckering the sock. So just give it some slack. Give it a little pull. If you have to make that stitch tiny bit big, I'm just wrestling with it now on screen, but now I've put the slack back in there. We want that same little Mona Lisa smile, and then we're fine with our color change. And having twisted those yarns together the way I did means that this one is now locked in, and when I go and bring it up later, this is not going to come loose and it's not going to create a hole here. So make sure that you do a full twist when you change colors. And I'm going to knit around this because I'm going to show you how to get rid of the jog. So when you've changed colors, you knit your first round in the new color. You just start with it, having twisted them. That helps to prevent stitches opening up and creating a hole. You'll have to watch me knit all the way around. And for those who have never seen anyone knit like me, I flick knit, which is why it looks a little bit weird to some people. Remember at the corners when you're changing needles to pull the first 2 stitches a little bit tighter and then you don't get ladders. One of the reasons I like flexi flips is because the tip sits next to the needle and so you don't end up with tension on the hole. Regular DPNs don't do that and they're more prone to getting ladders as a result. Ladders are just, there's a loose gap in between your stitches. And the same thing can happen in ribbing. When you go from ribbing to stocking stitch, you can get the same problem. And what it is that the yarn is passing between the stitches on the needle and it creates some slack. So if you shorten the path by doing a tighter purl before you move to stocking stitch when you've been ribbing, you will tighten that up and get rid of that problem. All right, we're almost there. So when I'm talking about flexi flips, this can move. I can pull this up so that this is sitting right by the other needle and it's just easier to work with. I get a lot of questions about flexi flips and I've converted to doing all my sweater sleeves and socks on them because I just found they got rid of my problem with ladders. So now we have come around and you see how there is a bit of a hole there. That's why we twisted those, because when we pull up the green, that gets rid of the hole. Now we're about to start the second round in the new color, and this is where we can do our little trick to get rid of our jog or minimize it. We're going to pick up the right leg of the stitch below the new color on the first stitch of the round and put it on the needle, and then we're going to knit those 2 together. And what that does is it smooths out the jog and gets rid of it. There's lots of different ways to deal with jogs, but in a sock, that's actually a really good way to do it because you don't have a lot of challenge with it. It doesn't give you a lot of distortion, and it's also not going to pucker. So my little trick of twisting every single time that there's a color change, you can't, or every single row rather, you can't do that with the foot of the sock because what you do is you end up with those colors looping around each other and then they show on the front of the sock. This also, unfortunately, the feel of it doesn't translate through, but where this had caught every single or almost every one of them with the color change transition, it's very bumpy. And so then that puts a rough spot in your sock. This got rid of your bump. So you see how they're now lying straight just by putting that leg of that stitch up there. So that's another nifty little trick that you can use. And when we look at the feet of this sock, if you don't want to do that, by the way, you don't have to. You can have a jog and it won't hurt a thing. But on the bottom of this sock, the stripes don't have really noticeable jogs. Really what's going on here is more of a color variation. When I straighten out the rows of stitches, the jog is almost invisible. There's a little bit of one on this one, but again, that's a little bit more of the color variation on these than anything else. That gets rid of the jogs, and you can use that in anything like a striped sweater or what have you. There's lots of different methods, but that's the easiest and fastest. And for a sock, it doesn't create a lot of volume. Now, if you don't want to carry the colors, and you absolutely do not have to, you can break them for every stripe. And some people, that's what they like to do. Other people are, shoot me now, I do not want to have to weave in all those ends. If you would rather weave the ends in than try and carry them, and if you're a princess, and I am a princess, I will tell you, I might not want to carry this because there is a line of yarn under my foot. And because I will blister if you look at me, that's uncomfortable. So I am more prone to doing this, where I have broken the yarn every time. In order to prevent that hole from forming when you break the yarn and move to the new one, what you're going to do is tie half of a knot there, and then you can weave your ends in. And you notice how I've left a little floof when I cut the yarn? That's because you want a little bit of something there to fluff, and it means the stitch won't keep popping. So this one I have fluffed and this one I have not. What I usually do is I'll either take a darning needle or my knitting needle and I just fray that end out. Sometimes they'll just fray out when you wash them. But when you do that, then this isn't going to pop out again and it's going to stay put. Anytime that you're weaving in ends, if you fray out the end of the end, now you don't have that pop, 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 pop that can happen. And what I mean by tying a knot is you're just literally going to take 2 strands of yarn and you're going to, and this is not really side by side, it doesn't matter, 1 loop of a granny square. That's all you need. And then weave it in the direction that it's pointing, and then that will not open up later on. So these ones were done with that half a knot there, and you see how the yarn is running in the direction that it was pointing. Once I did my half knot. And you won't get any bulk on the bottom of your foot. It's nice and smooth, so it's a good way of doing it. There are no issues in terms of having a lumpy thing that runs along the bottom of the sock. And again, you can't feel this, but as I run my thumb up here, I don't feel anything there. I do feel something here just lightly. So you can carry the color, that's not a problem at all, or you can break it on each stripe. Now, one other consideration about carrying versus breaking and weaving in the ends is that if you have somebody wearing the sock with feet like my hubby, he is super hard on his socks. And if this is on the bottom of the ball of his foot and there is a carried strand, he is eventually going to wear through that. In a superwash, that's a problem because you will get a hole opening up and it's really hard to fix it because you've got so little slack there. So for him, I will break on stripes because I don't have to worry about him wearing out that strand that's carried along the bottom of the foot. For me, aside from the princess feet thing, I never wear that out because for some reason I never wear holes in my socks. It's really weird and annoying because it means that if I buy a pair of socks and don't like them, I will have them for 10 years because I just have different feet from him. So carrying yarns on the bottom of the foot, definitely an important consideration to think about what you like best and what's going to work for the person wearing the sock. Most of the time I carry the color. Oftentimes I will put the color change on the side of the foot for me because then I don't have the strand on the bottom. And if you decide to do that, then just leave a stitch marker instead of in the middle of the heel turn at the corner where you start the gusset pickup, and then that moves that to the side of the foot. So that's another little thing that you can do. It's not in the pattern, but it's a little tweak on moving the carry to the side of the foot. And again, you got to be a real princess. I've got weird skin. I never ever form callus. And so that means that I will just blister the entire time if there's something that's going to rub my foot. The toe of the sock is a standard wedge toe. I'm not going to demonstrate grafting in this video. We do have grafting in the one for the radical slope socks. And if anybody wants me to set up a grafting video, what I'm going to do is I'll video one and put it on YouTube by itself so that you just have to watch for the grafting video. It's like probably 2 minutes instead of watching an hour of this one to get back to the grafting kind of thing. But this is a standard wedge. Some of them will have you doing the decreases on one row, the knit on one row, and go all the way to the end of the toe. And that will elongate the toe a bit, and it will give you a more pointy toe. This one I did a little bit more round. So I have a vanilla sock pattern, and I did it with the same decreases all the way. This one, you do a decrease row, a knit row, a decrease row until you get to part of the sock, and it will vary on which size of sock where you are. And then you're decreasing on every single row. And what it does is it just rounds the toe out more. One of the modifications that you can make on sock toes is that you can stop this toe wherever you want. If you have a really straight set of toes on your foot so that you don't have this sort of a shape, you can stop this sooner and just have more stitches to graft. So sometimes people are concerned because a wedge toe doesn't fit them, but you don't need to worry about that. I guarantee you there are no knitting police who will come and say, hey, you have to go all the way to what the pattern says, but that toe is then too pointy for your foot. If you need to elongate it, then in the pattern, when we have the toe shaping, oops, went right on by it. In the toe shaping, it says repeat these 2 rounds until there are X number of stitches on there. What you would do is repeat these 2 rounds all the way to the end when you get to the number of stitches that you finish on. That'll make it a little bit longer and a little more pointy. I happen to have super pointy toes, much like my hand here. So my toes are shaped like this. And my second toe is longer than my first toe. So for me, this toe is a little blunt, and I will do the wedge all the way to the end instead of flattening it. But I hope that's making sense. You can do a little customization, and it's one of the reasons why I put the wedge toe on the sock, was that then you could customize it a bit for your foot shape. On the gusset, you don't have to do the number of stitches written in the pattern. If you have a narrow heel, you could reduce the number of stitches. So if you have a wide foot but a narrow heel, so a wide front of your foot, narrow heel, you could do the number of stitches for a smaller size in the gusset, and then just the rest of them are left as instep stitches. So when we're doing the gusset, you have some flexibility in how wide the gusset is. And like I said before, for me, this gusset, it's a standard rectangular gusset, which most sock patterns will write. I will actually add at least 3 sets of rows onto it to make the gusset taller, because I just have a need for extra room in there to make the sock fit me. It doesn't change anything other than the number that you pick up along the side, and it will mean that my gusset will be a little bit longer in terms of the decreases to get down to the foot size, but that's fine. It doesn't change the fit of the sock in any way that's not positive, and it's not harder to knit. With the colors in the foot, wow, I'm going to come in on exactly 1 hour here. Cool. With the colors in the foot, if you have a really short foot, so one of my friends has a size 4 foot, her sock would end here. You can reduce the number of rows in the stripes to make them narrower so that you can have more stripes in a shorter foot. Or what you can do, depending on where your sock toe has to start, is you might need to knit the toe in the color of the last stripe. Nothing wrong with that. It's not going to hurt the look of the sock in any way, shape, or form, but just don't try to force yourself to have a full stripe and a new color if that's going to impinge on how well that sock fits you. If the toe is sitting there without the light stripe, it's not going to hurt the look of the sock. So you may end up, if you are changing the length of the sock, having to compromise on either the depth of the rows for each stripe, or just start it with whatever color you're at, because it tells you to start the toe 1.5 inches before the end. And that's more important, 1.5 inches for the right length for your foot, but it's more important to do it when you're supposed to than it is to try and make those stripes line up. So that's just something that you can do if you have a short foot. Make them 6-row stripes instead, and then you will have more stripes in a shorter foot. And again, if you have really long feet, you could make them longer too. It's all fine. One last thing, one of my test knitters was confused because this stripe up here is 10 rows and these are 8 rows. That's intentional. I wanted the crabs to be well away from the cuff and for the cuff to have a little room to pull in if you're doing a knit 2, purl 2 cuff without distorting the crabs. So yes, there are 10 rows here, and the rows in the foot are 8 rows. The stripes rather here are 8 rows. And in between the crabs are 4 rows. You can change that. So this particular test knitter did actually change that when she got to the heel flap, because she suddenly realized that the sock was getting to be a bit long. So she just took 2 rows out of the stripe in between and has 2. So you can play with those places on the sock and do whatever you want. I, as the designer, give you full permission. So that covers everything that I wanted to go over on the sock. I do want to just remind you that the chart's there's a chart for each size, and it's labeled on the top of the chart, and it's labeled on the writtens. So just be aware of the fact that each size has its own charts. It does make the pattern a little bit longer, but I felt like it was more important to not have the charts be confusing because there's multiple sizes than to do it otherwise. So does anybody have any questions at this point? And there is one in the comments. Are we planning to have more sock clubs in the fall or winter? Not necessarily. We weren't planning for it, but if there was a lot of requests for it, then we would absolutely be willing to do something like that. EU that there are more socks planned to be published. They weren't necessarily in a club, but if people would like to have a Zoom for a new pattern, and it doesn't matter which one it is that we're publishing, we're more than happy to set up a Zoom and do some techniques and tricks on them, because that is one of the fun things about doing these sorts of patterns, is that you can go through and find the things that people need help with, or that people just simply want to talk about. So anytime that we have published a pattern and you guys think it would be fun to do one of these, for sure. Next coming up, Cal. First of all, Sock Club, we have a September Sock Club. That one is a really interesting sock because that's a helical sock. So it will give you, if you've never done a helical sock, a chance to try it out. And it's a very pretty slip stitch pattern. It will be a good sock for expanding your skills because the way that the decreases are done for the gusset are a little bit different too. And then in addition, we have a shawl knit along that is coming up using the Breezy Starlight shawl. So there will be a permanent Zoom for that. If you're watching this Sock Zoom a year from now and you would like to do a shawl that has tips and tricks as well, Breezy Starlight. So you're very welcome to the people who are saying thank you. And again, I'll just check to make sure that nobody has questions. And I'm just going to put this on gallery view in case somebody has a hand up and I don't see you. No, not seeing any hands. All right, so what we're going to do with the video is that we will have this, it has been recorded, and we will get it posted so that you'll be able to watch it again later. And we will send out probably an email, or I'll mention it in a social media post or something like that so you know when it is posted. We just always go through and we'll do a little bit of editing and make sure everything is clear. So thank you so much for spending a Saturday with me, and I really hope that you enjoy your Crab People socks. And I wish you happy knitting. Thanks so much, everyone.